third book, The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny. And so here, I want to talk a bit about loneliness, which seemed like a smart way to open this conversation, but it's also a strange conversation to have in a room full of people who share a love for books and are about to have the same experience with these characters. But the theme of loneliness is it courses through this novel, and I'm interested in knowing how, if this is a feeling that you were thinking about grappling with at the onset of this book, or did the subject of loneliness, the experience of loneliness, become interesting to you as you began writing?
You know, I can't exactly remember now, and sometimes I say one thing and sometimes I say the other. But I know that it definitely is true that I wanted to. And what I'm saying is that I'm not quite sure whether the idea of the love story came first or the idea of loneliness came first. But I did want to explore the theme of loneliness in our globalized world. And well, let me think. Perhaps I first began this book, all the way back when I was a student in Vermont, in Bennington, Vermont, working in the library during winter and summer breaks, and experiencing both painful loneliness and also writing my very first stories, and at the very same time experiencing a sort of artistic loneliness, an exquisite artistic loneliness, of being so absolutely happy to be working in that beautiful snowscape, in that quiet library, where I began reading Anna Karenina and Kundera's Unbearable Lightness of Being, Kawabata's Snow Country. I think that's also around the time Garcia Marquez wrote his Love in the Time of Cholera. And perhaps that, the idea of the loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, perhaps it goes back to my always having wanted to put a book on the shelf alongside those books. Mm-hmm. And however, writing, when it comes to writing an Indian love story, in the past of my parents, but definitely my grandparents, a love story would have been centered in one community, one class, one religion, most likely one place. But in our globalized world, setting it out into the world, I felt a love story could, go in so many different directions. And it seems like just a matter of chance who one might meet when and where. So the characters, as they are wandering out in the world, keep thinking, why this person, why here, why not somebody else, why not there? And as they are moving across geographies, their sense of self is changing. At the very, they're searching for a sense of belonging and home, but at the same time, their sense of self is becoming so much more fluid. So I realized at that moment that I could at least extend the scope of the novel from romantic loneliness to thinking of loneliness in other forms as well, in terms of the great divides between nations, the rage between nations. I chose to see it as a kind of loneliness, the huge class divide, to look at that as a kind of loneliness, to look at the sort of promise and failure of feminism as a kind of loneliness, and so to just just think about our modern world, look at how modernity affects our spiritual beings in terms of love and loneliness.
It's the characters they're not bound to the traditions of their families, as you said, but they also can't depend on the order of their families. And so the fact that they can, these are characters who can in many ways come and go, and they do come and go. They're migratory throughout the novel, but the ability to move within this world is somewhat double-edged. It's a freedom, but it also feeds into that
Yes.
inability to find, or the struggle to find your home.
Yes, as one of the characters says to another, you have no idea. Loneliness is actually it's a great fortune. It's the life of a fortunate man in a country of plenty. That you don't get to be to get to be lonely is actually a lucky thing. And for many of the characters, so I did want to talk about that as well, that loneliness is also sometimes we seek out and escape from our sense of identity. We search out ways to lose it. And loneliness can be a time of self-transformation. It can be a necessary solitude. It can mean, for Sonia's mother, who leaves an unhappy marriage, the peace that comes after war. She says it's like the experience of sunlight dangling in a quiet room after the war is over, I think she says. And she tells her daughter there are many worse things than loneliness, and loneliness can be sustenance as much as it can mean shame. So I was interested in all of those different moods of loneliness and solitariness, and also to talk about how they differ. It can mean Eastern spirituality, for example, that rests on being alone and being solitary too, or a Western sense of individualism. That too can be seen as a kind of loneliness. You have to do so many things on your own, as one of the characters says, which I found too true of the United States as well. You have to learn to do everything, right? Put up your shelves and fix a tire and drive and get a job and pay your bills and look after yourself when you're sick, and kill a mouse or chase off rats, which is what I'm doing in New York right now. And it feels very lonely, by the way, to be dealing with a warren of rats all on your own. So, yeah.
It's also you move in. In some ways, the novel is technically omniscient. You move into the minds of a few different people, although we are fairly focused on the love story, the love story that we're sort of trying to catch. Like, there was a taste of it in the beginning, and you're chasing it through the book, and then
the characters actually meet. What is it? A third way through? No,
they do.
Yeah, they only meet. They meet after 250 pages.
Yes. I mean, it's well worth the wait, for them and for us. Like, it's, they make it worth our while. But in a great novel, you could have shifted the story, and we would have stayed within the world of any of these minor characters, because they're so developed. They'll make each other mad. They'll do maddening things to the other, and then you slip into their mind, and you feel like this well of sympathy and affection for them, even when they're the most difficult people.
You're thinking of Babita, probably.
Babita is,
incredibly greedy character. Greedy and awful and racist and annoying, and But in some ways, she was my favorite character to write.
Okay, that was my question. Which characters did you most enjoy writing?
It's so interesting to me, because when I'm reading something like Dickens, you just think what stays with you are all those peripheral characters. Yes. They're so wonderful. And so I didn't want to lose all of those voices. And I was also going to mention one of the other things about loneliness and political loneliness. One of the characters, Albana, who's a peripheral character, Albana from Albania, who's the bartender in a bar. The character Sunny frequents often after his girlfriend leaves him. His Kansas girlfriend leaves him for all the right reasons, and he's depressed and goes to drink in the bar. And Albana from Albania says to him, "You have no idea what you're talking about." She says, she of course grew up during a time of authoritarian rule in Albania, and she said loneliness is not having the privacy of your own thoughts. Loneliness is constant surveillance. So I was using all the side characters to sort of to give depth to Sonia and Sunny's story, and also it was important to me to write about all the different love stories that affect theirs, that their parents' love stories or lack thereof, their grandparents' way of marrying, that idea of marriage that goes back to an Indian past, that was important for me to try to not just to isolate the Sunny Sonia story, because quite often when I'm reading an author from the Western author, someone from Europe or the United States, and the story is focused on two characters, and I keep thinking, like, where are the aunts and uncles and grandfathers and grandmothers and parents and siblings? And I just thought, an Indian story, you just cannot leave those voices out, because even if they're absent and the family is dysfunctional, as is, Sunny's families, and so is Sonia's, but the absence is so present even that you just can't not include that. Even the gap is so that emptiness when they're not present is also so huge. So yeah, that's why it extends in so many different ways.
Yeah, they're so present in their absence, sometimes even louder in their absence.
Yes.
It's impressive and it's wonderful. It's
yes,
as they are.
Often are, in death. I mean, that's also one of the observations that Sonia's father makes, and I found that when my own father passed away, that he's somehow more present now that he's not here in my life. He's closer to me. He's constantly in my mind now that he's not living his own life somewhere else.
Yeah. There's a beautiful moment in this book. Well, there are thousands of beautiful moments in this book, but there's one that I found so interesting in that we have a very minor character, Pooja, who, if you can tell everyone a bit about Pooja. Again, very small role, but she captures something that's very much at the heart of the novel. And I sort of gasped when I read this, and Kiran was generous enough to agree to read it aloud. So
yeah, and I think, in fact, Sheila, this is something I just spoke about, and we just you just asked me about, so it segues nicely into that why here and why not there, why this person. This is Pooja and Satya. This is Sunny's friend, Satya, who's a doctor, and comes from a more conservative background. And what was interesting to me with these characters was trying to write about an Indian doctor in rural America, where often there's an Indian doctor in a very small place, and that's the only foreigner around. And my brother-in-law was a doctor in rural Kentucky, and I would hear these extraordinary stories from my sister of their time there, which are really moving and so different from my immigrant experience. So I included a little bit of that with Satya and Pooja, but they have an arranged marriage, unlike Sunny and Sonia. And here's Pooja, and she is on a honeymoon. The evening before, when they had stood as small as wedding tinsel at the hem of the night ocean, she had thought, why here exactly? Why am I married to this man exactly? No particular reason for him over another man. No particular reason for Goa instead of another place. A few chance occurrences had brought them together. Thus Pooja had her first sharp experience of the why here, why not there emotion, and it unnerved her. She had in the past always been where she was supposed to be without thinking about it. Oh, thank you. But this is also what I was thinking about, the grandparents in this story, that people in the past were always where they were supposed to be.
Yeah.
And now, so one of the characters, Sonia's father, says to Sunny at one point, he said, when you're young, it's all right to be anywhere in the world, but there's a certain time in your life you wonder who you should have become rather than the person that you are.
Yeah. This is also such a delightful moment because Sunny is on the honeymoon with his friend and Pooja, which is which is hilarious and magical. But of course, they're all trapped in their own lonely worlds, even though it's a fairly crowded space. I mean, 3 people's a lot for a honeymoon. So, but they're all together.
Better 4 than 3.
Better, yeah. yes, it would be. But even then, they're all trapped within this psychological loneliness. And Goa is such an interesting presence in the novel too. Could you speak about that?
Well, I was really going to go a lot because, and I knew that I wanted to write one more book at least that was set partly in India. because I knew that I was losing that landscape. Once my father died, I just knew that I would not be able to go back in the same way. I would never go home again. And I was losing the memory of my grandparents. I wanted to make sure that I, kept held on to that. And India was changing. So India has been changing so drastically politically. And those people who were born during the time of British India and who very deliberately transformed their lives and their thinking and their habits in favor of building a secular nation, or sort of letting go of caste and community in favor of belonging more to a bigger idea of India, that group of people was dying out, and I really wanted to write about them before I lost the ability to do so. And the bits that are set in India are set in my grandparents' home, the same home I used to go to, and the same veranda. And the Delhi bits are set in my father's home, where I would also go back. But I was going to Goa to write a lot, and I was writing on the veranda, which was full of stray dogs, who I fell in love with, of course, who are so unbelievably charming and have like such a busy life of their own, and they entered the book, of course. So I was working there, and I realized that I could write about a changing India from that landscape. A very old Catholic, it's Portuguese, it was a Portuguese colony, so a conservative Catholic background, but of course being completely undone by tourism. And also, at the moment the book is set, is the late 1990s, early 2000s, when a different conversation started happening in the living rooms in India, and there's been a big rise in Hindu nationalism and a majoritarian rule. And those changes were happening, and I wanted to write about that. And I wanted to write about the fear minorities were experiencing, Christian and Muslim minorities were experiencing. So that became part of the book as well.
And there's a whole world of people who are serving these kind of lonely drifters, these wealthy lonely drifters, and they too have their own story of India and self.
Yes, because these are very westernized characters who can afford to be alone in this way. And while the beginning of the book, there are people who have, the grandparents of Sonia are so shocked that anybody could be lonely at all. And they say, lonely? They have no patience with loneliness because they've never eaten a meal alone. They've never slept in a room alone. They may know a certain loneliness of being misunderstood, or a certain loneliness of the feeling of the endless afternoon siesta, but they've never really experienced this being by yourself.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the process of writing. We have a lot of writers in the room. There are always a lot of writers in the room in Oxford, and it's one of the beautiful things about our town. But it takes a long time to write a beautiful book. And I find myself talking about this, kind of breaking the loneliness of the writing process by talking a lot about this with students and fellow writers, that we have to maintain a certain stubborn faith while we are writing, and hold our own hand through a process and believe in something in its development as it develops in our head. And I'm just wondering what advice, guidance you have to offer us.
So I sometimes teach also, and I think I often have to tell my students, so much of it is psychological stamina, and you have to build it up, because a lot of times a very talented student does not produce a book, or sort of drops out of a writing life, is because they do not have that psychological stamina or that trust in their ability. And I think the way I get over it is the way I build it up, and the way I conquer that doubt that you're speaking of is just by discipline. Building it up day after day, year after year. And as I was, this book has a lot of characters who are writers. Sunny and Sonia. Sunny is an aspiring journalist, and Sonia an aspiring novelist, inspired by Garcia Marquez in his observation that fiction and journalism are two wings of the same bird, which is extreme. So two different ways to get at the truth, I suppose. which they're both trying to do. But what was I saying? So there are a lot of observations and thoughts about the creative process. And one of the characters remarks, and I feel this about myself, that you just become the way I work is to work like an ant or a bee or an earthworm and just carrying, like just transposing, converting one crumb of reality into artistic life, into the artistic realm, like bit by bit, like just to get up and trust that that discipline is going to keep you going even when you're working towards something you can't see, right? That's beyond your vision, that's over the horizon, and you have no idea what you're building for so long. And so it's just the discipline that keeps me going in the end. Thank goodness for it, because now I realize that it's so strong after all these years that it can get me through almost anything. I mean, I could write even when my father was dying. I could write even through those difficult emotional or psychological moments.
Do you have a particular routine, or is the routine just discipline?
The routine is to just get up in the morning and go straight to my desk. Yeah, and that works well. If there are any writing students in the room, it's the early morning. The first early morning hours, I think, are very good hours.
I do often find that I'm saying to students, like, don't take an 9 a.m. meeting, or you like don't
Yeah,
don't
and
take
make
a
notes.
meeting.
I mean, if there really are students in this audience, the other thing I would say is just keep diaries and make notes, and every single day. And those helped me so much, because it's incredible how much you forget. And all the little details in my book are all from journals and diaries that I was keeping.
And that my next question relates to that. I mean, there's the anthropological, the sort of hilarious anthropological lens of this novel. I mean, when you examine the world as closely as you do, it's just so funny. And I would love to hear you talk about humor. I'd love to hear you talk also about just the life of an observer, how that's shaped you.
I think you train your eye, as a writer, and that you train your eye by keeping the journal. And minutely observing, and why is it funny? Because life is both. I remember hearing, and now why is his name escaping me? How embarrassing! Who is the great Israeli novelist? Not David Grossman, but an older one.
Amos Oz?
Amos Oz, who had written, I remember hearing him speaking about putting his work together. Thank you for that. Millions of observations. And he also said that life is both tragic and comic. So it's natural that a book is, not only tragic or only comic, but tries to combines the two.
Yes, there's not a slapstick moment in this, for sure. But there are moments when the pain and the humor are in such proximity that it's just, I mean, that it hits you in different ways. You laugh, and it's also wrenching.
And it became very important to me to write that way in this book particularly. I think because my last book was very political. The Inheritance of Loss is much more political book. And this time, perhaps it gave me the confidence really to turn to writing a love story, and to write about the love stories about the grandparents, Sonia and Sunny's parents, Sonia and Sunny, and to really go to that far more vulnerable place, the conversation two people have alone in a room, and those very private, quiet moments, and those domestic details. And it was far more challenging, because their vulnerability makes the writer vulnerable as well. So it is much harder than to write an angry political novel. It was much easier. And here I was really doing politics only for the sake of art, the way it influences these people, in their smallest moments, in their quietest moments.
You talked about writing through grief, writing through anything that is pulling you either into the world of your novel or outside of the world of your novel. This is obviously a distracting and complicated moment, and we are, I think, as artists, as professors, as just people who care about humanity, grappling with how to how to give, how to be generous, how to, just how to care for ourselves and others, everything. How do you either wall off the world or let it into your own writing?
It's very hard right now, no, because of course you feel called upon to speak out. And yet what's really interesting to me, because I saw this happen in India when fear was injected into the conversation and people were too scared to speak out. And I remember going around trying to seek help for writers who were in trouble in India, who had been imprisoned in India, and people who were so sympathetic to them would not sign a petition, would not say anything at all. They were too scared. They wouldn't be allowed back into India to visit their parents or grandparents, or that something horrible would happen to them. And I saw that, I thought that, and I had some insight into this because of reading. I was so grateful I had read all these Latin American authors and Eastern European authors, because then I thought, what is happening to India now? I never thought it would happen in India, that we're meeting like exiles in cafes and people are scared to have their phones on them. And I remember going to a house and being told to put my phone in the freezer, and I said, really? Or in a cocktail shaker. I said, really? That's supposed to keep me safe from the government eavesdropping? Or under cushion, I don't know, all these things. But that was interesting to me, and so that's been happening in India for a while now. And I am just so stunned to find that beginning to happen here, because I live in a very immigrant community in New York City. And I'm just seeing the fear of people now, whatever the subject is, Israel, Palestine, whatever else is going on in the world, that fear is starting to seep into people's minds and hearts. And that is very scary to me. I'm not talking of loneliness, my theme of loneliness. There's so much loneliness in that fear, in this political fear, and in that shame that people are feeling. There's so much loneliness in that.
When you mentioned Sunny going to this bar and having this bartender who later on kind of moves on and forgets about him, but which is another sort of loneliness, like the loneliness of these minor characters who move in and out of our lives is another way that the world kind of reminds us of our solitude. But in that moment, in that exchange, you also capture a kind of you capture a certain, but I'm sorry, I digress there with the mention of Bana the bartender, but he's in a relationship, and when he goes to see her at the bar, that relationship is ended. And you have these two really interesting characters, Ula and Sunny, who are just doomed as a couple, but again are on their own complex journeys. And she's somewhat of a migrant too, being from rural America and being in New York City. Yes,
and she says to him that it's easier for you coming from India than it is for me coming from the Midwest. That New York, welcomes foreigners from the other side of the world more easily than it does from the Midwest. So she's made this huge, huge journey herself, and that is a really tragic relationship, really, because they so love the image of themselves in the mirror, that these two people from two completely different worlds, and it's so brave and it's so adventurous. And yet Sunny, who is being sent to the United States as a very westernized Indian, that whole journey has been happening through generations. He's sort of been brought up to leave and to belong, and seeks out Ula, I think, for that reason, as a way of belonging to the United States. And so he's very proud that he's with a white woman, really. And then at the same time, he's ashamed to be proud for that reason. And he begins to attack this image that he himself loves so much in the mirror, leaving Ula completely bewildered. And she doesn't understand why he's unwilling to share his background with her or his country with her, because he's so scared she'll make use of it in a kind of old colonial way, and that old colonial history comes bursting in, and that huge power divide between nations comes into their relationship. His regret, his sort of fury at that power divide which is just, of course, nothing but an accident of birth where we come from. And yet, of course, it so defines us. Much of the way the book is constructed, the secret structure of the book is who is captured by whose gaze. So who gets to tell the story when it comes to countries, or when it comes, when it comes to nations, when it comes to journalism, when it comes to art.
Yeah.
When it comes to men and women.
Yeah. I have many more questions, but I'd love to turn it over to the room.
Hear from all of you too, especially if they're writing students.
Yeah. Come on, let's see hands. Come on, y'all. You know you have questions.
Are they your students in the room?
No, with some, but I can't just cold call Jackie.
No,
I mean, what terrible person would do that? Yes.
I'm not a writing student, but what you're describing is a beautiful story that I look forward to reading. But I think in this time we, the power of the pen from certain government entities to just make wholesale change. It seems to echo the Indian partition. And does partition play a role in some of the themes in your book, or some of the sources of loneliness?
Yes, it does, because I think that was the deep psychological trauma for so many Indian families. And it's interesting to me, I live in a neighborhood in New York called Jackson Heights in Queens, and it is very Hispanic, but it's also full of, there's a large South Asian community, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Tibet, Nepal, India. And it's fascinating to me because, in South Asia, all these countries were divided. And here I'm living in a community where we're all together in a way that we were really supposed to be. And so it's very moving to me to live there. But I would say that partition, that it's not just a past trauma. I mean, the effects of partition are so deeply still unfolding in Indian politics today, in the politics of the region today. India and Pakistan are still going to war. At one brief moments in time, there's been a little moment of hope that there can be some sort of normalcy and exchange. There was a time when writers from Pakistan could come to Indian book festivals, and then the government stopped it. Or, musicians from Pakistan whose the music was so beloved in India, they're being blocked. So it's so sad. And I think that for my parents, this was the big event of their lifetimes. They both were born in British India and lived through that partition when their neighbors, my mother describes, their neighbors, Muslim neighbors, sort of moving overnight, that Delhi became a different city, and woke up one morning and the neighbors were gone. And so all these divides, and her parents were, German and Bengali, and from Bangladesh, and one lost the German landscape and one lost the Bangladeshi landscape. So their languages as well had to change. Their home, the landscape, the language, everything they had to make a very necessary change. Yeah.
I wonder, I hear, and forgive me, but I remember hearing about the treatment of women recently in India, where they've been molested and raped, and on a bus, and nobody does anything about it. I just can't believe that, people would treat people like that.
Well, there's a huge amount of sexual violence, and it feels like there's an epidemic of it, in fact, going on. And I think what's happened is that there was always a great deal of violence against women, and but one of the new groups that are being targeted now are very modern young women out in the world, in the professional young women who in a previous generation would have lived at home and been very safe, but these women are now out on their own, traveling on work and living on their own, and they have often been very brutally attacked. So there's this, you see this change happening, and you feel like these young women are so brave. And their parents are so wonderful, because the parents have brought up their daughters to think they can do anything they want, and brought them up to be professional young women, and then society fails them, the country fails them.
Like in Afghanistan, where they...
Yeah,
I
Afghanistan,
mean,
of course, it's much worse.
The
But
male were threatened by these new females.
it's wonderful. And Sonia, actually, the character in my book, comes upon that, because she is a young working woman. So she has a life in the United States, but also one in India, and she does come upon this, a bit of this experience. Yeah.
You have a question?
Yes.
Do you have in mind an Indian writer we should all be reading that we don't know much about?
Oh, that's a nice question. Yes, there's one very good one. I was just reading him myself. His work is in translation, and his name is Perumal Murugan. Murugan, Murugan. And he writes about, it links to the question you asked. He writes about rural India, where caste is still so important, and writes very much about violence against women and how women are treated. But it's not depressing, by the way. I mean, you think, oh my God, I'm going to read that book. Not at all, because, for example, the book I was reading was called Paya, and it's about intercaste marriage, but the relationship is so tender, and it's so much part of the natural world and of that village life, and descriptions of the goats and the ants and the smells and the culture. So it's really also lovely to read. Yeah, that's one. But you could also be reading Arundhati Roy's new memoir about her mother. It's also a lovely book. This came out.
Yes.
I'm not a writer, but I am curious about, I heard you, I don't know if this is right what I read, that you turned in a large draft copy.
Yes.
And so what is that process of editing? Is that painful? Is it liberating? Is it, I mean, what did you leave out? And kind of
It was at one time I was just writing, as I happily just told you, like an ant or a bee, but then writing like an ant or a bee over years. I finally went and printed out my manuscript, and I had not numbered the pages, and when I printed it out I found that there were 5,000 pages. And I was was terrible, and I was at a writer's residency in Brussels, of all places, and they were so shocked, and I was so shocked, and I was so scared. And I read all those 5,000 pages, but actually and then I was looking for echoes, storylines, themes, and I lifted the loneliness of Sonia and Sunny from those pages. So when I look at those manuscript pages now, there are several different colors of ink, and I've read through them, and I have, I can see that where I've lifted this strand of story from here, that strand of story from there, and then put it all together. Yeah, but yes.
Is there another novel in those pages too?
I hope so, because partly, the story about Satya and Pooja, actually, that was one thing I wanted to write about. But I also wanted to write a little bit about this German past is very interesting to me, of how it could be that an Indian man and a German woman could have married in 1920s Germany without any complaint from either side of the family, and that it was so progressive. It's astonishing that the wedding sari was sent from Bengal to Germany, and she cut it into, it was a mauve sari, and it was cut into a dress. And my grandmother was a newspaper editor's daughter, and she sailed to India in the 1920s and went back only once before the war broke out. And then such a history unfolded, because India was fighting Germany alongside the British. At the very same time, India was also fighting for independence from the British. And a lot of families had, it was such a complex thing that you might have an uncle who was in the army, and you might have an uncle in prison who was thrown into prison who was a freedom fighter, all within the same family. And we had that situation, as well as a German grandmother, a German woman in India, and Germans were being sent to prisoner of war camps. And some of them stayed for many years, and they were both German Christians and German Jews, because even fleeing German Jews, the British put into the same prisoner of war camps, which my mother is a novelist, her name is Anita Desai, wrote a really wonderful book called Baumgartner's Bombay about this history, sort of drawing on her family history. But it's very interesting to me. I remain so interested because I just keep thinking of that rise of nationalism that we're seeing and how it unfolds. And then you think back to this time when, when such marriages were actually possible. She sailed to India with her Goethe and her Schiller and all her books and her trunks of china. And so my mother grew up with her father's Bengali literary heritage and her mother's European one. And I think I was lucky, therefore, to grow up with those bookshelves and also have both those traditions in my right from when I was a child. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about character building, I guess, and to what extent that's kind of sketched out, or ideas or notes in advance. I mean, what's the interplay between an image maybe you had in your mind early on, and then how the character organically develops as you write?
Yeah, good question. Perhaps that was what I was doing in all those thousands of pages. Was really following all the characters in this book through a lot of their lives that didn't make it into this novel. So really trying to understand who they were and how they would play against each other, because of course as a writer you're also just orchestrating a larger piece where one character plays against the other, and so you're not going to have two characters who do the same thing in the novel, who play the same role in the novel. So I would say that I actually think about the ideas in the novel before I think of the characters. And yet, there are some characters who do surprise me. It was difficult for me, I think, to consider writing about a character who would be incredibly politically incorrect, because of course I was worried that I would be accused of being politically incorrect, because that's what always happens. Writers are always confused with their subject, or people always think it's your thoughts, and you're the character. But I wanted to write about, the racism within communities of color, and how they're so racist towards each other, and that sort of hierarchy, and nobody ever talks about that because it's such a taboo, but so what people say behind and that's of course why we read literature. We want to know what people say when we're not in the room. So I wanted to write that. So she was a character, it's a completely imaginary character, but really surprised me, and I was really loved writing about her. Yeah, this is Sunny's mother, Babita, in the story.
Jackie.
Hi.
I'm also not a writer, but as I'm listening to you talk about writing about loneliness and colonialism and just love and topics that to me would just make me cry, like putting the pen to paper, like at the first touch. And I'm just curious how, maybe this could be a question to all the authors in the room, but how do you just continue to produce this very emotionally just heavy content without having to desensitize or de-emotionalize just the way you're writing?
Do you want to answer that, Sheila, since it's for all the writers in the room?
I don't think she meant that. I don't know that you have to. I don't know that anybody wants to write or read something that is emotionally distant. But I find, I think every writer is going to have a different answer and sometimes a different answer depending on the day you ask them. But I would say that you have to care deeply about what you're writing in the same way that you have to care deeply about anything you're doing or producing in the world, or to not do something else if that's not what you care about. But sometimes the distance allows you to manipulate and play with the characters in a way that is sort of limitless. And so, yeah, I mean, I can see how maybe that passion is double-edged, that you needed to get into the story, but you don't. You want to let the characters breathe and move of their own volition.
Yeah, and also I think one thing when I was writing this book, I also thought, we read for pleasure. That we actually read for pleasure, and sometimes we forget that. That what we really are looking for when it comes to art is, we are not looking to be miserable or to be educated. We pick up Jane Austen, we want to get into their living room and we want to hear the gossip of these ladies having tea. So that was also in my mind, that I was allowing the pleasurable bits to come forth and the happy bits to come forth. And it's also interesting to me because, talk about loneliness, and I see that when people are talking about this book, there's a whole conversation. Some of them are treating me a bit like a therapist and saying, what do we do? And other people are saying, well, it's really not so as lonely as all that. It's hardly, the world is not that lonely. And others saying, well, it's so lonely. So it's quite interesting to see just this conversation around this subject, which after all the US Surgeon General just said was a big epidemic in the United States. He said that we're really getting more and more lonely. So it's interesting to me to see how people are responding to this book and that debate. But it's very hard when people say, what do we do if you're lonely? Yes?
Just following up with that, I've been thinking this whole time, I haven't read the novel yet, but this idea of loneliness, and I'm thinking specifically in white, middle-class American culture, is that just about everything is really connected to that baseline of loneliness, shame, embarrassment, guilt, ambition.
And fame, celebrity culture, which I think also makes us very lonely because, it's just the strangest thing, this celebrity culture, I think.
It just very much strikes me. I've thought about loneliness in a different context, and so I'm excited to read this because I feel like that's where this is all about. You're making me excited to see how it is expressed in this form. To think about loneliness in a more of like a psychological kind of context where I have read about that. This is going to be really interesting.
I think one of the characters in my book quotes the mystic poet Rumi and says, exile and love both undo your sense of self, and also in solitude is safety and in movement is safety. So, all of these things that we also seek it out. And for me, I definitely do, and I use it for my work. Yes.
What do you mean by movement is safety?
This is because Sunny is the character in the book. Sunny, he is. His mother says of him that he moves a lot. He moves from India to the United States and then eventually to Mexico, and several big political events happen in India. The episodes of violence, political violence, and September 11th. The book also encompasses September 11th. And it's interesting to me because he's a young journalist looking at how it is written about in different parts of the world and how the news morphs form. So he's moving, and his mother says, just as his luck fails to find him, so does his tragedy. That somehow he's luckily not in the wrong place at the wrong time. So and yet at the same time, Sunny says, answering back mentally, but in movement is also the opposite because, if you're all on your own and traveling, like you could be killed just for your shoes, maybe. You're sort of also in danger. So I have to say that a lot of the book is, there are all these contradictions in the book, and I think that there's a lot of mysticism in the book, a lot of mystic poetry in the book, and I'm just a lot of thinking about how very different contradictory things can be brought together, and in a novel, even aesthetically, like how do you put together such different places and such different ideas and such different thoughts, and it's almost as if like only art can bring these things together, can reconcile these things. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more. Okay.
Yeah.
One more. Lynn.
Yeah.
Well, two more. Do you have time for two more, Jude? Sure. Okay, two more. All right, you start us off.
This is not related to this book in specific, but I'm just wondering, how do you transition between projects? Because you need very different mindsets to think about different themes in collections.
Between different books, you mean? Yeah, and sometimes I think I'm in a conversation with myself, and you know how, and the way I think an artist thinks about their work is so different from the way a critic or a reader does, because you're just in conversation with your own work sometimes, and only you see the arc, a particular arc. And I think when I wrote my second book, The Inheritance of Loss, I was writing against the first book in a way. I was sort of arguing against my first book, which was a very childlike version of India. Reads like a folk tale, and it's a very beautiful picture. And then I thought, this really does not encompass any of the darkness at all, and it didn't feel real enough to my own life or what I'd seen, and I sort of wrote against that version. And then with this book, I can see I'm combining the different ideas, because Inheritance of Loss was completely realistic. The first one was really whimsical and like just really a folk tale with some sort of magical elements to it, one at least. And with this book, I sort of combined the two. I didn't feel like either was quite right, and I sort of put them together and sort of aesthetically tried something different. Yeah.
Lynn, you want to close us out?
I'm just wondering, your mother is such a great writer, and I imagine that sort of maybe not encouraged you, but gave you support to be a writer, and I'm wondering what sort of influence she has on you, or had on you.
I grew up with her bookshelves, like I said, yeah, and also this discipline that I'm talking about, I'm sure I grew up with that discipline, because it was, she had this extraordinary discipline. So when I began writing, I didn't have to fight so hard to find it. It felt like the rhythm of my childhood. I knew that quiet of a writer's house and the quiet of a writer's life. That came really naturally. And then sometimes we work together, and we go on writing holidays together. She's now 88, so she's not traveling so much, but she published a book last year called Rosarita. It was set a bit in Mexico, and we would go and work in Mexico together sometimes over the winters. And then I find that, when I read her Mexican work and I read my Mexican chapters, and I see that the same scorpion that we both saw is in both the books, in things like that, or the same little village where we stayed, where there's this very lovely, this fisherman's graveyard on the bay. It's in her book, and it's in my book. So that's a lot of fun. And this veranda that my book opens on this veranda that were my grandparents' home. That veranda has also appeared in her work. Her book Fasting Feasting begins on the exact same veranda. Yeah, so that's lovely. But it's just been incredible fortune for me to have her in my life. And she also edits my work, by the way. She's my first reader and reads the first draft, and I was looking at the edits, the pages, very meticulously written in her tiny handwriting that very few people can read. But I can see where she's written cut, and then she's written if you don't cut, shorten, underline many, many times.
So her last book was about this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and I think as she says, as she grew older, she's had to, make just her ideas as trained, clear, and she's never written on a computer. She writes by hand, and then she types it out, and then she spends a long time with scissors and like whiteout and like cuts and pastes and sticks her manuscript together. But her work is always really clear because she can't go back and write 20 different versions. So she has to do a lot of it in her mind before she even begins working. Yeah. And it's philosophically also, you just see how her work has changed as she's grown older. And her work has become much more philosophical, no longer just rooted in India, characters or places, much more mysterious even. So, there's that wonderful book Edward Said called On Late Style, and you think what artists do, the artists who grow old working, who worked for such long periods of time, like what happens to their work as they grow older. And I think she published her first book in her 20s, and she's now 88, and she published her last book when she was 87 last year. So she's written through all of these enormous changes and, seen all of this history through the lens of art. So it's been really a privilege to see her. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.